A lot has been said about the massive crisis of relationships between men and women, ravaging the Western world and, quite possibly, many other regions as well. Rising rates of sexlessness for both sexes, but most predominantly for young males, and rising amounts of people living single, and thus most often childless, are undoubtedly one of the factors contributing to the demographic low fertility crisis. The mentioned causes are usually culturally determined, such as the ascension of dating apps like Tinder, the female educational hypergamy being impossible in a world where women are, on average, more educated than men, the collapse of traditional cultural norms connected to Christianity, and so on. All of these are surely very significant influences. After all, such a massive social change is undoubtedly a multi-factor issue. However, in this video, I want to look at the issue from a more purely demographic perspective. Very interesting demographic data suggest that a relatively large part of the issue is caused by a simple and pretty obvious, yet often overlooked variable: the sex ratio among the population in the relevant age groups. Women and men increasingly do not live in the same geographic areas, which creates significant sex ratio imbalances. That makes the dating crisis pretty much unavoidable, due to purely mathematical concerns. Before I get to the nitty-gritty of it all, I want to give a shout out to my Swedish friend David Lorentzon, who did a lot of research regarding this topic, brought it to my attention, and wanted me to make a video about it. He has a presentation on YouTube on these topics. If you want to watch it, the link is in the description. So, let's get to it. The crucial variable is the different occupational and educational orientations of men and women. Women tend to attend colleges significantly more than men, and then tend to predominate in fields such as education, healthcare, psychology, sociology, anthropology, government administration, care work, personal assistance, artistic and entertainment professions, or journalism. In comparison, men tend to heavily predominate in fields like construction, carpentry, and the majority of other trades, metalwork, manufacturing, mechanics, engineering, or natural resources extraction. To simplify, women prefer people-oriented jobs. In contrast, men prefer jobs focused on things, on objects. Now, purely from this brief overview, one can see that female occupations have very significant urban bias. Not only are universities logically mostly urban affairs, but most of the occupations are firmly connected to metropolitan service-based economies. Large hospitals or large educational or bureaucratic institutions are, absolutely logically, placed in large cities where they make the most economic and logistical sense. On the other hand, most of the heavily male occupations either do not have any clear bias and can be practiced equally in urban and rural areas, such as construction or trades, or do have a rural bias, such as mining, farming, oil and gas drilling, forestry and whatnot. Manufacturing plants are also usually located outside of the largest urban areas due to factors connected to labor and energy costs and available land. The result of this dichotomy is clear. Women from rural areas tend to heavily migrate into the cities, significantly more than men do, since men have a higher economic ability to make a living outside of metropolitan service-based economies. That, however, creates an issue in the form of unbalanced sex ratios, with male surpluses in rural areas. Now, one has to take into account that all around the world, purely naturally, more male babies than female babies are born. The reasons for this biological phenomenon are not entirely clear, but they are not really important to the subject of this video. But it is a fact that in Western countries, for every 100 female babies, 105 male babies are born. So there is a slight male surplus in every population among its younger age cohorts. This male surplus then tends to get turned around between 40 and 60 years of age in most countries, where the higher male mortality rates tend to overwhelm the sex ratios at birth and migratory trends. In the older age brackets, women tend to predominate, often heavily. However, in the age brackets relevant for mating, gender imbalance remained a significant issue. In the past, significant male mortality rates usually took care of these surpluses. But that is not the case in the contemporary developed world. Almost everyone survives up to an old age, and the cumulative surplus of males in the age brackets relevant to mating is thus often quite significant. The issue is clearly revealed to us when we look at the data. Here is a map of EU regions from 2016, showing the sex ratio among the 20 to 33 age bracket, which is the most relevant one for mating. When you examine the map, you can clearly see large metropolitan areas, such as capital cities, having a female surplus in this age category. Other than that, the vast majority of areas have a male surplus of various intensities, most often up to 10%. 10% is quite a lot. In an area with 2 million inhabitants, a 10% difference means 200,000 more men than women. You can also see certain clear hotspots of heavy male surpluses, most notably in ex-East Germany or rural Sweden and Finland. The male surplus in these areas often reaches 20%, which is basically a Chinese level. East Germany is an area with low population density, so there are not a lot of large cities, from which mass emigration to the western part of the country occurred. As we can see, this emigration had a big female bias. But the whole of Germany is very badly affected by this issue. Interestingly, a bunch of countries seem to be in a better position, with larger numbers of females among this age cohort, specifically France, the UK and Ireland. France and the United Kingdom are among the countries where the overall immigration has a female surplus. That can be possibly explained by the large number of international students at the local educational facilities. In the UK, the proportion of female international students was 55%. In Ireland, it was 54%, and in France, it was 53%. I have not found this statistic in Germany. However, since the most common fields of study for international students in Germany are engineering, manufacturing, and construction, it can be presumed that there is a male bias. However, other factors explaining these female surpluses are surely relevant as well. Do not worry, I will mention the influence of international immigration in the next chapter. Now, this is somewhat anecdotal evidence, but I checked some EU report on the issues of incels in the European Union. They checked the countries of origin of users of some incel forums. You can immediately see that the order of countries does not precisely follow the population numbers. By far most of the users were from Germany, 3 times more than from the UK, even though Germany has only 20% more people than the UK. France, even though it has the same population as the UK, was in 7th place, lower than Poland or the Netherlands. Now, once again, I am aware that other factors most likely play a role. In the case of France, it may be a language thing, where they have their own forums where they complain in French. But it is interesting nevertheless, especially considering that Sweden, a country where the issue of unbalanced sex ratio is very pronounced, is in 3rd place, even though it has only 10 million people. Once again, language might be a factor. Swedes are known for their fluent English. Nevertheless, there are more than 5 times more Swedes than Irish on the forum, even though the Irish have half the population and are native English speakers. So, the sex ratios in these countries certainly might play a role. To stay in Scandinavia, here is a map showing the male surpluses in different Scandinavian regions. As you can see, the issue is prevalent in regions outside larger urban areas. We can now move across the Atlantic Ocean to examine the situation in North America. Now, I could not find any age-specific sex ratio data for the United States, which is a bummer. But the US Census Bureau just does not provide such data. So, we can only look at the overall population sex ratio, without insight into the situation in the age brackets relevant to mating. However, even on the whole population, we can see a clear correlation between male-biased sex ratios and population density, and thus the rural and urban divide. Most counties in the part of the United States west of the Mississippi River have a clearly visible male surplus. If you consider that among the age groups over 60 or so, there is almost certainly a significant female surplus even there, it means that the male surplus in the younger age brackets must be very significant. I have also found a map showing the sex ratio in major metropolitan areas in the United States. Here, the results are more varied than in Europe, since many metropolitan areas in the western half of the United States have male surplus. However, here, we can observe a pretty strong correlation with military bases being present in these metropolitan areas. In Canada, there is also no data on the sex ratio in the most relevant age groups. However, the sex ratios for the population aged 18 to 64 also reveal a clear trend of male surplus in the less metropolitan regions, with a higher share of extractive industries in the economy. Moreover, there is a fascinating study researching the characteristics of areas in the US where inceldom seems to be more prevalent. The researchers analyzed millions of tweets that somehow revolved around issues connected to incel stuff and found out that the best geographic predictors were a combination of demographic male surplus in the area, low percentage of single women, and economic inequality. So, these sex ratio imbalances certainly play a role. Yet another factor that likely significantly influences the shortage of women is that marriages, or serious long-term relationships in general, do not last that long nowadays. The average length of a marriage ending in divorce is between 10 and 15 years in Western countries, and the divorce rate is somewhere between 40 and 50%. However, there is a significant gap in remarriage between men and women. Older men tend to remarry significantly more than older women. While this likely has multiple reasons, it is at least partially caused by the fact that it is significantly easier for somewhat older men to remarry and have a new family with another, often younger women. It is definitely not uncommon to see men being so-called second-generation fathers, where they have one set of children with one woman, and then a second set of children with a second woman later, often a younger one, especially if the men are economically successful and thus desirable. These younger women is then not getting into relationship with a man of her age, thus further enhancing the sex ratio imbalance. In countries with low fertility and thus a significant decline in births from generation to generation, there is also another issue. Generally, women tend to prefer slightly older men, and vice versa. Men prefer somewhat younger women. Well, if you look at the population pyramids of countries like Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Poland, Italy, or many others, you can see that the population decline itself presents an issue, since you have significantly more people in the 30 to 40 age brackets than in the 20 to 30 age bracket. That means that, once again, more men compete for fewer women. If you add all these factors up, the natural sex ratio imbalance caused by biology, and the fact that this imbalance is nowadays accumulating over most of the age brackets relevant for mating due to historically super low mortality rates for males, the geographic disparity in where men and women tend to concentrate due to the different economic and educational preferences, the fact that a lot of marriages end in divorce, and past a certain age, it is significantly easier for men to remarry and have a new family than for women, and the fact that in countries with low birth rates and declining populations, there are just significantly more people in older than in younger generations, the result is clear. Even if we do not get into all the cultural and technological stuff, like dating apps and hypergamy and weaker monogamist culture norms, and focus purely on the population numbers, some form of dating or mating crisis was pretty much inevitable. You can ban Tinder all you want and return to strict monogamist norms or whatnot, but in many of these areas, the women just physically ain't there. Now we can proceed to the issue of international immigration. I have already covered this in my video on Sweden, but I think this issue is very interesting and deserves a more thorough description. One of the most interesting things that my friend David found out when researching this issue is that while mass immigration into Europe or Sweden is, in the popular consciousness formed by media coverage, usually perceived as being heavily male-dominated, The overall immigration statistics are relatively gender balanced. With the exception of the UK, there is usually a slight male surplus, but nothing drastic, for example 52 to 48% in favor of male immigrants. So, international immigration is an additional factor, making the already existing sex ratio imbalance even worse. But it is not as large of a factor as many people likely think it is, especially considering that most immigrants migrate to large urban centers that generally have a female surplus in the relevant age brackets. However, when you look at the data regarding the countries of origin of different immigrants, there are massive differences in sex ratios. Looking at the statistics of countries that actually publicly provide information about the gender and countries of origin of immigrants, for example Sweden, United Kingdom, Germany or Italy, there is a very distinct pattern. There are certain regions of the world from where immigration is heavily male-dominated, most notably Middle Eastern countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, Iraq, North African countries, and most of Sub-Saharan Africa. These are the classic migrants who usually come to Europe via the Mediterranean or the Balkan route to claim asylum. This migration is notoriously male-dominated. Other male-dominated source countries of immigration are usually Western countries. In these cases, it is probably caused by more conventional labor migration, possibly often in more male-dominated technical areas. There are no big surprises here. Where it gets more interesting are the female imbalance countries. There is a very diverse and seemingly heterogeneous group of countries from which females heavily dominate the migration. Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, China, and so on. In some cases, especially in Southeast Asian nations like Thailand or the Philippines, the number of female immigrants is really overwhelming. Now, why is that the case? The most likely correct answer is that this is a marriage/relationship-induced immigration. Other explanations are surely possible, such as the prevalence of female immigrants in these countries' healthcare or social care systems. Since Filipino workers are the second most prevalent foreign group among workers in the British NHS, this certainly plays a role. However, it is not the whole story, and it is also not entirely mutually exclusive. One can marry a woman who works in healthcare after all. One gets a useful insight when you look into the immigration statistics of places like the Faroe Islands and Svalbard, remote, cold, rural northern islands with very low populations. These places deal with severe sex ratio issues due to the immigration of young women seeking education and employment elsewhere. They are thus a perfect, even though extreme, proxy for the situation of rural, remote regions dealing with these issues. In both cases, there is a significant immigration of women into these islands, with close to 10% of the population of Svalbard being Thai and Filipino, the vast majority of these being women. Most of these women are in a relationship with local Norwegian men, whom they met through online matchmaking websites. As was already mentioned, the United States does not provide a gender breakdown of immigration from different countries. However, it is for sure interesting that 37% of all immigrants to Alaska are from Southeast Asia, and 30% from the Philippines alone. It is pretty clear what is going on there. It can be reasonably presumed that similar immigration patterns are prevalent, even though in more moderate numbers, all over the Western world. In areas dealing with significant male surpluses in the relevant age groups, like other Scandinavian countries, Germany, Canada, the UK, or the United States. Men from these regions are generally considered attractive by women in various international polls, presumably due to the combination of looks and economic resources common in these developed countries. If you look at the countries from which this female-dominated migration is coming, it also makes a lot of sense. Generally, it includes middle-income countries, not completely impoverished with a lot of illiterate women, but pretty far from Western living standards, that are culturally relatively compatible, and people often see them as countries where you can get the so-called threadwife. That is a trend that will continue for as long as the massive dating crisis exacerbated by the deep sex ratio imbalances continues. And it most likely will continue. It is an interesting paradox in the heart of the system. When it comes to men and women's opinions of immigration and ethnic change, men are usually much more opposed to it than women are in Western countries. However, they are significantly negatively affected by the dating crisis caused by the aforementioned demographic factors and other cultural forces. As I already noted in my video on the possible similarity between future ethnic composition of the West and Brazil, where the majority of the population is to various degrees ethnically mixed, throughout the West, there are generally no strong cultural taboos regarding intermarriage in place among the native white majorities. When Western men are facing a dilemma between being unable to find a spouse in their own country or finding a non-European spouse abroad, most men will choose the latter, at least if they have the money to pull it off. While people do have an in-group preference in mating, both cultural and genetic, this preference is by no means rigid in the West. The imperative for reproduction is stronger than the imperative for in-group preference in reproduction. While such immigration flow won't make any news headlines, since there is no crime and upheaval connected to Filipino women marrying Swedish or German men, the cultural impacts will also be notable and interesting. Since these immigration streams usually lead to family formation, the direct cultural and ethnic diffusion is immediate. As I mentioned in many of my videos, the fastest growing ethnic group in most Western countries, at least those that provide such data, is the mixed race group. The continuous trend of Western men being unable to succeed in the mating market with male surpluses making competition even harder, importing women from abroad will surely accelerate these trends. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, or consider supporting me on my Patreon or on my Buy Me a Coffee. Thank you very much.